This video contains flashing lights throughout. If that bothers you, you're probably going to want to leave the video now. It's okay, I don't mind. Have fun. This is not a story about the Beatles. This is a story around the Beatles. It was 54 years and some 2 months ago today that the iconic group The Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, regarded as one of their masterpieces. And it was that action of releasing music to the world that would eventually lead to the film adaptation 11 years later.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band!
It bombed terribly, definitely killed one career, and was mainly the folly of one single man who the Beatles loathed. Film and stage producer and all-around entertainment mogul, Robert Stigwood. It got mauled by critics in its time, a lukewarm reception from the public, and still to this day is regarded as one of, if not the, worst films of all time. And 30 years later, long after the hatred had gone and the movie was at least partly forgotten, a child was born in Gondar, Ethiopia. That child is me! Hi, I'm NKZ. But you can call me Nick. And today we're going to look at the tale and try to analyze the existence of this movie, starting in 1967, culminating in 1978, and being revisited in 2021. So, it is with light heart and small brain that I bring to you Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the movie. Part 1, the album. In 1967, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It is a very loose concept album following a live performance of the titular group. I say loose because there isn't necessarily a plot to it. Producer George Martin said that the concept didn't materialize until halfway through working on the album. We'll come back to him later. I'd say that, compared to other concept albums, which are like stage plays, Pepper is like an improv show. There is a premise that they are working in, but what they do with that premise is entirely freeform. Anyway, not much that can be said about Sgt. Pepper hasn't been already. To put it plainly, it was a success, commercially and critically. Enter Robert. Part 2, Robert Stigwood. Before Robert became the empire you know him as, he was merely Robert Stigwood Associates Limited, a talent agency for TV commercial actors. One of those actors, John Layton, found a giant fan base of mostly teenage girls, and even a fan club. Stigwood realized he had something to capitalize on, and started shopping him around various record labels after asking him if he could sing, and getting the answer, yes. Sort of. Eventually, John and Robert met Joe Meek, an independent producer at the time. Layton's first single was pulled, since another artist on the same label was recording it. Of course, John and Robert kept on going. This is a recurring theme. Layton recorded Johnny Remember Me, it hit #1 on the British charts, and Robert had become a music producer. Stigwood had a business model of complete control over the star that was threatened by, you guessed it, the Beatles. They wrote their own songs. They had staggering amounts of creative control. Oh no! But you don't get big in the music industry without knowing how to adapt. And Robert would, with the help of Brian Epstein. Brian was, of course, the manager of the Beatles, and he was fed up with it. At this point, managing the Beatles was all ego, and it didn't even have the fun parts of that. He didn't want this. He wanted to go manage bullfighters in Spain, apparently. But in Robert, he found an out. He found an heir. And so, Robert started considering selling his company, NEMS Enterprises, to Robert Stigwood. This is as good a time as any to explain that the Beatles did not like Robert Stigwood. And that threw a wrench in this transaction. They told Epstein that if he sold NEMS to Stigwood, they would only make out-of-tune recordings of God Save the Queen for the rest of their contract. And you wouldn't want your top artists to become petty pranksters, would you? So, in 1967, NEMS was not completely sold to Stigwood. Instead, only 51% of the company was given to Robert and his financial backer, David Shaw. Sadly, Brian would pass away later in 1967, which would have poised Robert to take over NEMS, but the Beatles did not want to work with him. So he left with a golden handshake to form RSO, the Robert Stigwood Organization. The next few years were pretty good for both parties. Robert had good success with Cream, Eric Clapton solo, and the Bee Gees. He also expanded into other fields like Broadway productions and, of course, movies. The Beatles released 5 more albums before calling it quits, and all members had varying degrees of success on their own. And that could have been where the story ended. A weird mini feud between two music industry powerhouses. But then, 1974 came. And that leads to Part 3, the musical. Yeah, the Sgt. Pepper's movie is actually an adaptation of an adaptation. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on the Road was a short-lived off-Broadway production directed by Tom O'Horgan, who you may know for other Robert Stigwood-backed musicals like Jesus Christ Superstar and Hair. It did not do well. In one of its reviews, fellow Robert Christgau said, "Artistically as well as commercially, the Beacon wasn't 1/3 full on the 4th day of the run, Sgt. Pepper is a flop." After 6 weeks, the show was canceled. Stigwood said he canceled it because it wasn't what he had envisioned. But of course, he kept going. Which... that's weird, right? Usually when you have a failure, you try and distance yourself away from it as much as possible, especially in the show business where money and reputation is involved. What motivated him to keep going? You know, there's a certain quote from the 2003 episode of Biography focusing on the Bee Gees, where former editor-in-chief of Billboard, Timothy White, says this.
There's no reason to make the movie. There's no reason to involve the Bee Gees in it. There's no reason for the Bee Gees to cover the Beatles' music. It seemed a project done for Hollywood reasons rather than musical or artistic reasons.
And I vehemently disagree. Yes, money was involved, it always is in the entertainment business, but it didn't work before, and the Beatles did not like him. There has to be some other, greater reason for this being made than the Beatles make money and we love money. Of course, Stigwood died in 2016, so I will never be able to ask him why he kept going. All that we have now as scholars is articles and to analyze the commercial appeal. So it's here where I'd like to stop and ask, why? Sometimes when a project is regarded as quite bizarre and bad, you might wonder what the creator was thinking when they made it. And I have a feeling that when I explain the movie to you, you're gonna be thinking that. So I want to contextualize this a bit. Just explain why Stigwood and co. thought this might be, at the very least, a good business venture. And to do that, we need to talk about another film.
Columbia Pictures and Robert Stigwood are proud to announce
Part 3.5.
Tommy, the movie.
Is, at face value at least, extremely similar to Sgt. Pepper's. It is a mid-70s film produced by the RSO based off of a rock album from a well-loved band. It also had a star-studded cast of actors and musicians, and that cast actually sang the songs. Unlike other rock opera films, the cast re-recorded the songs in character for the film. Also, Tommy made bank. The soundtrack album sold 100,000 units in the UK and 500,000 in the US, and the film made $34 million worldwide. Of course, this is all just speculation from a man who has never seen Tommy and was born 3 decades after these movies came out. But I don't think it's too wrong to say that all this success might have motivated Robert to dig up the grave of Pepper and make a movie from it. Speaking of which... Part 4, Pre-Production. The Beatles and Stigwood reunite, this time to enter a year-long negotiation process over the film. It culminated in a 90-page-long contract involving that a Beatles management company rep, or as the Bee Gees biography put it, a snitch to Lennon and McCartney, would watch the screenings of the footage of each day, as well as John and Paul's approval over the director and writer. Who did they approve? Okay, so Sgt. Pepper's and Tommy are similar projects on paper, but there's one important problem with this comparison, which is that Tommy already had a narrative. To call back to a previous analogy, it was a stage play. It literally had a Broadway adaptation in 1992. And despite that, Sgt. Pepper's The Album was still an improv show. But it's not impossible to create a jukebox musical like this. You just need a good writer. So who do we got? Henry Edwards? Henry Edwards is a peculiar choice because he's not a fiction writer or even a film writer. Let me correct myself. Henry Edwards, real name Henry Katz, was known for one work of fiction before Sgt. Pepper's, novel Harlan Smythe Grossfeld, a satire on the school system. So it is wrong to say that he is known only for his nonfiction work. But it is still right to say that before this, he was not a film writer. This was his grand debut. Back to our regularly scheduled video essay. You may know him for his more recent career as a self-help book author of all things. Wrong again, Nick. Or for writing Stardust with David Bowie Story and Loving John, a book co-written with May Pang about her relationship with John Lennon. Speak of the devil. Apparently, Edwards saw this as, quote, the musical of the future, and wanted to create something different from the other Beatles films and more like 50s MGM musicals. So who's the director? Michael Schultz. Another interesting choice, considering that he had never directed a musical before. Up until this point, he was known for Cooley High, a coming-of-age film called a black cinema classic by NPR, and Car Wash, a black stoner comedy with Richard Pryor, the Pointer Sisters, and so many more. Speaking of which, the cast of this film is a monster. It's just everyone. The Bee Gees, Peter Frampton, Steve Martin, Aerosmith, and my personal favorite, Billy Preston as the magical Sgt. Pepper Golden Weather Vane come to life. If you know a star from the late 70s, chances are they're in this movie, and there's even more at the finale. Also, the cast is quite inexperienced. One of the main roles, Strawberry Fields, is played by Sandy Farina, who apparently had never acted before and would never again. The Bee Gees had only acted in a weird made-for-TV comedy, and that was when there were only 2 members. Peter Frampton had only done a cameo in a Dracula movie and one role in a World War II drama. There are, of course, experienced actors, George Burns, Donald Pleasance, but they aren't the ones playing the title band, are they? So that's probably a bad idea, but nonetheless, it was an idea in motion. Sgt. Pepper's would finally come to fruition on the big screen in 3, 2, 1, Part 5! Filming and recording. In October 1977, filming started on MGM's Backlot No. 2, home of the Andy Hardy films. The old lot was repainted for a film and soon became Heartland, USA, your classic American town. Oh, and by the way, according to Peter Frampton's Behind the Music episode, they started filming without a script.
Because there was no script, it's like, okay, in this scene, look amazed.
What is this, bad idea number 5 now? Rolling Stone got to be there during the filming of the Mr. Kite Parade, which really shows how extravagant this was. There were hundreds of actors, doubles of the band for a trampoline sequence, 2 guys on roller skates in a horse costume, the whole 9 yards. Millions of dollars were poured into this movie. They weren't... well, I was going to say they weren't playing around, but the 2 guys on roller skates in a horse costume probably beg to differ. And despite being part of the same fictional band, Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees did not work too well. Peter Frampton was the star of the film. He was Billy Shears. And the Bee Gees, at least according to Barry, did not have much to do in the story and didn't do too much demanding. They were just there, not doing a lot and literally getting drugs at their feet by shouting into the void. Peter and the brothers Gibb recorded vocal tracks separately, although that's less because of some supposed conflict, and because Frampton felt he didn't fit in with their harmonies that well. And while this was happening, the soundtrack for the film was also being made, and made by George Martin. Yep, we're coming back to him. The 5th Beatle joined with hesitance, saying that whichever way it turned out, it would offend someone. But eventually, with the help of his wife, he was brought onto the project. Before the filming, Martin was in Cherokee Studios in LA and Record Plant in New York with a group of musicians. The process was this: listen to each song a few times, copy it note by note, improvise, and create a compromise. They were updating the music for 78's kids, making it sound less quote-unquote dated, while still keeping some songs, Strawberry Fields for example, similar and sacred. And that philosophy also bled into the vocal recordings. Barry Gibb said, "We could have gone crazy on a lot of those tracks. We wanted to use falsettos and so on, and to some extent he let us do that. But not all the way. He's got real tight lines the way he wants to go, and he made that clear to everyone when we were doing it." In 1979, Barry would later attribute this as one of the many reasons why the film, more specifically its soundtrack, failed. I don't think that George Martin should have produced Sgt. Pepper again, and I think George knows why. George was religious with the original arrangements. He didn't want to change them. What the people were looking for was something totally new. And totally new we got. In July of 1978, the Sgt. Pepper's film finally was released in theaters, in all its strange glory. Oh, and by the way, this film has so many other weird details that are just completely left out here. I didn't even get to the robot servants' chest keyboards, but that's a whole other thing, honestly. Okay, Part 6, the movie. We have spent a lot of time talking about everything Sgt. Pepper outside of the film itself. So what is this movie about? Our story begins in Heartland, USA. Well, actually it begins during World War I in the village of Fleu de Coupe. During the Great War, Heartland's Sgt. Pepper Marching Band was the country's darling, bringing joy and music during some of America's toughest times. In 1958, to commemorate them, Heartland's mayor and only speaking role, Mr. Kite, unveils the Sgt. Pepper weather vane in Pepper's likeness. And at the showing of the vane, when Sgt. Pepper plays his instrument, he keels over and dies. Yeah, pretty dark way to start the film. Sgt. Pepper leaves his band's magical instruments to the town. As long as they remain in Heartland, the people shall always be happy. His musical legacy was left up to his grandson, Billy Shears, played by Peter Frampton. Billy eventually forms a new band with the Hendersons, played by the Bee Gees, and they are managed by record executive in the making and Billy's half-brother, Dougie Shears, portrayed by Paul Nicholas, who was also in Tommy, by the way. Speaking of record executives, exactly 20 years after Sgt. Pepper's passing, a letter comes from the band, courtesy of Big Deal Records president B.D. Hoffler. Billy bids farewell to his girlfriend Strawberry Fields, and they fly out to L.A. The band, I guess after being drugged, sign a contract with Big Deal, and soon they're on their way to stardom. While Billy and the Hendersons are living it up in L.A., Heartland gets a new visitor, Mean Mr. Mustard and his robot servants, the Computerettes. Mustard is in town to steal the famed magical instruments and pass them along to other big bads that are colleagues of FVB. As soon as this happens, it all falls apart. Heartland becomes a hotbed of decay and grunge, far from the happy and innocent small town it once was. Seeing this, Strawberry flees to LA to find the boys, and they steal the instruments back from other FVB allies. The cornet is with Madman Dr. Maxwell Edison, Steve Martin's debut film role by the way. The tuba is with crossing guard turned cult leader Father Son, portrayed by Alice Cooper, and the drum is in Mustard's van. 3 out of the 4 instruments have been found, but the saxophone is still with FVB. But that can wait, because Heartland is in absolute disarray. To try and help the town, the band throws a benefit concert with clowns, Earth, Wind & Fire, and of course, Henry the Horse. Concert, Dougie and Lucy of Big Deal label mates and non-characters Lucy and the Diamonds, played by Stargard, try to steal the benefit money by hiding it in Mustard's van. But soon, Mustard and his non-character henchman the Brute take the van, which includes those magical instruments, and kidnap Strawberry, who Mustard has fallen in love with. This is a big moment in the film, where we meet our final boss, FVB, the Future Villain Band. the evil force that would poison young minds, pollute the environment, and subvert the democratic process, played by Aerosmith. Dougie, Lucy, and Strawberry are trapped. The big bads are quite literally singing their victory song. It feels like they might just win. But then, the four heroes return, and they fight with FVB, hand to hand. Strawberry kills the evil singer, because Aerosmith wasn't going to let Peter Frampton kill one of their members. True story. But then, Strawberry tragically falls off the large stage to her death. The instruments have been retrieved. Heartland can be saved. But at what cost? This part of the video contains references to a major plot point in which one of the characters attempts suicide. If that bothers you, skip to this time code. This shakes Billy, sending him into depression. This culminates in Billy's attempted suicide, but mid-air, he's frozen by the Sgt. Pepper Golden Weather Vane come to life. Yeah! Woo! The Weather Vane, played by fellow Billy Preston, uses lightning bolts to transform Dougie and Mustard into religious people, I guess. And he also stops Billy from dying and resurrects Strawberry. The film then ends in an homage to a Sgt. Pepper's album cover, with a collage of 70 stars all singing together. A grand ending to a very weird, not good movie. Part 7. Well, Nick, what did you think about it? Okay, so I haven't been very objective here. I didn't think I had to. This isn't a school essay. So I'm going to give my review of Sgt. Pepper's here. Full disclosure, I did start watching this after writing a part of this script. That probably shaped my view of it. Nonetheless, here we go. I didn't hate it. Maybe it's just my rock bottom expectations and the fact that I am inexperienced with the Beatles to say the least, but I did not hate this film. Heck, I even liked some things. The title song slaps, the fact that the Big Deal Records logo is just RSO is just funny, and the montage of California Stardom is charming, especially when knowing that television specials like these did happen then. The opening of this film is especially good. Like I said, that title song slaps. It was saccharine and hokey for sure, but it was a fun kind of saccharine and hokey. And it did not seem like a bad film by any means. And then,
I want you.
That's it. That's the moment everything went wrong. Okay, maybe I'm a bit hyperbolic, but the song I Want You, She's So Heavy really is the place where that affection started to die down. Personally, I don't like the rendition. I had never heard the Beatles version before this, and I hated this one. It's just ugly. And while nothing is as bad as Heavy, although some parts sure do come close, the movie does get a bit sour after this. My main criticism of Pepper is that it is sung through. This is apparently something that other rock operas do, including Tommy, but it does not work here. The songs were already composed without an overarching plot, so the other parts of the movie act like a silent film, with narration, visuals, and, in the grand silent film tradition, title cards trying to actually explain the story. Most of the songs don't really help the plot, and sometimes the plot actually halts for a song. When Mr. Mustard steals the van and kidnaps Strawberry, there is no reason for Earth, Wind & Fire to be singing Gotta Get You Into My Life. They're not even playing characters, it's just Earth, Wind & Fire. Also, if anything feels like the choice was made for Hollywood reasons, it's fixing a hole. The number itself is alright, but it serves no purpose to a story at all. It just feels like it's there because George Burns was in that God movie everyone liked. Maybe this will get butts into seats. I also mentioned that I feel that Lucy and the Diamonds are non-characters. They don't do much to help the plot. I am convinced that they are only there to cram another Beatles reference in. And a lot of the other characters are rendered one note by this. But then again, this film really wasn't meant to have a complex plot necessarily. Thanks to the New York Times, we know what Henry Edwards' intent was, to create a classic good versus evil story, like Harry Potter or, as referenced in the article, Star Wars. Now, I've never seen the original Star Wars trilogy or any but the first Harry Potter films, but don't movies need well-developed characters? Even good versus evil stories? What are FVB's plans? We know they want money, but how do they mean to obtain it, and why? For that matter, what do the Hendersons want? Not involving the music group, they have around one emotion near the end, but otherwise, you don't know who they are outside of the band. You don't even get the most basic traits of their individual personalities. They put them in shirts with their names on them so you don't forget who they are. They do this with Billy in the opening too, for the record, but my point still stands that apparently they had such little faith in you remembering who the main characters are that they had to label them on their clothes like this. Like I said, some things are good in this film, but it's all bogged down by the fact that these songs don't have much to do with the plot and make the film feel slower and more boring with how many there are and how they keep following each other endlessly. I don't hate it. I'm not mad. I'm not even disappointed. I'm just annoyed. Part 8. The Reception. The reception was not good. Financially, it did fine. It was a minor box office success, making $20.4 million against a $13 million budget. The soundtrack started out performing well, staying in Billboard's top 10 for a few weeks. And then the reviews for the film came in, and it dropped out of the charts. Apparently, radio play started out great for the album, and then programmers started using only 3 or 4 of the 29 songs in infrequent rotation. It returned platinum. With over 4 million units being made, once billed by Billboard writer Ed Harrison as the greatest manufacturing task ever undertaken, and a lot of those records were taken off of shelves and given back to distributors. Hundreds of thousands were destroyed. One song that sold 1 million copies, though, was Got to Get You Into My Life. It was called An Innovative Rendition, and oh so cool. I think that it's really funny that one of the only songs that stood the test of time is the one that has the least to do with the plot and is the only one that wasn't produced by George Martin. People also like Aerosmith's version of Come Together, which also has nothing to do with the plot unless it's supposed to be another Alice Cooper because-style cult indoctrination anthem. But not everything was Aerosmith or Earth, Wind & Fire. Most of it was just flames. Which leads us to the critical reception. Oh dear God! If Sgt. Pepper's does have a legacy, this is one of the most famous pieces of it, which is that it was completely trashed by reviews. Here's what critics said about the film and album in 1978. The movie may have been conceived in a spirit of merriment, but watching it feels like playing shuffleboard at the absolute insistence of a bossy shipboard social director. When whimsy gets to be this overbearing, it simply isn't whimsy anymore. And from the same review, is it a film? Is it a record album? Is it a poster or a t-shirt or a specially embossed frisbee? This isn't a movie. It's a business deal set to music. Frampton sings the Beatles songs as they've never been sung before, it says in the press release. Well, yes, they have been, as a matter of fact. And better. A totally bubblegum and cotton candy melange of garish fantasy and narcissism. This quote is from a mixed to positive article, but I have to include it because, oh my god. Once again, folks, you're gonna want to skip to this time code because we're gonna be touching on that attempted suicide plot point again. As the scene progresses and Frampton climbs up on a ledge contemplating suicide, shouts of jump can be heard from the audience. From the song selection, you wouldn't even know the originals were once a rock and roll band. Most of the arrangements are lifted whole without benefit of vocal presence, maybe Maurice Gibb should try Hormones, or rhythmic integrity. Can't we get a little of that disco feel in there, George Martin? This is from 1983, but it is one of the meanest things I've ever seen in a review. From Dave Marsh's Rolling Stone Record Guide, 2 million people bought this album, which proves that T.T. Barnum was right and that euthanasia may have untapped possibilities. Prod projects based around Sgt. Pepper's were cancelled, such as the TV movie based around its production, and apparently a Heartland USA theme park. If you want extra-related media, you can find the novelization of the film, the promotional scrapbook, or the French, Dutch, and possibly Japanese language versions of the Marvel Comics edition. There were some positive reviews from the Valley Independent and the Intelligencer, but not nearly enough to drown out the negative ones. The critical reception is what you could say killed the film. You could, if you haven't spent way too much time analyzing what killed the film. Part 9, Yesterday. So here we're going to ask another why question, only this time instead of why was this film seen as a good idea, it's why did this film fail? So, let's ask the cast. The Bee Gees said that its failure was that it couldn't survive in the new Hollywood climate. It was too goody-goody and innocent. Like I said, it was intentionally inspired by old musicals, and it just couldn't stack up against grittier, more adult films like Saturday Night Fever. They also say that it should have been like 1978's Superman, with more visual effects and excitement. The Brothers Gibb also said that it shouldn't have been sung through, and they only should have used music from the titular album. Frampton would later say in 1986 that he thought the film was a bad idea from the get-go, and that he messed with the Beatles, the great unwritten law.
Dee brought it to me and said, "Do you want to be in a movie?" I said, "Oh yeah, love to be in a movie. What's it about?" "The Beatles." I said, "No. Sacrilegious."
So you could read this as that he thought the film shouldn't have touched the Beatles' music, a group whose members he had previously worked with. I've already explained why I don't like this film, but the reason why I don't like it is not the same reason as why it fails on a bigger picture, at least they are here. There is a deeper, larger reason as to why this film failed. And to do that, once again, we need to talk about another film. One thing that's interesting about Sgt. Pepper's is that there are at least 3 other films with the premise of using the Beatles' music after they broke up. All This in World War II, Across the Universe, and Yesterday. Yesterday is the one that deals most with the Beatles' legacy within the text. Full disclosure, I've never seen it, but premise-wise, it follows a hypothetical world where the Beatles are magicked out of existence, except for one guy who remembers them. You may be asking why I'm bringing this up. Let me explain. If we lived in a world where the Beatles never existed, Sgt. Pepper's the album never existed, and this was the only place people heard these songs, this film would have been received a little bit better. Not a lot, but better. You can tell through articles and the like that the creators of this film wanted it to exist in some kind of vacuum. Running away from the Beatles' legacy defines a lot of the story. That's the reason why it's set in America. That's the reason why it's set in 1978. After getting a question from Rolling Stone about if the movie might infringe on people's images of Sgt. Pepper, Peter Frampton yells in his trailer about how it's not the Beatles, it's not about the Beatles, it's just their music made into a story. But, as Rolling Stone's Ed Zuckerman says immediately after that line, this is not just any music. This is the Beatles.
Sacrilegious.
And that is the movie's fatal flaw. It wants to exist outside of the Beatles' legacy, but it will always be under the shadow of its more popular, older relative. Actually, here's a hot take. This film would have been better if it didn't involve the Beatles or their music at all. Just write your own rock songs, add actual dialogue, keep the same level of extravagance, but still take out that future villain band nonsense. Just make the record company the bad guy. You know, Almost Famous, but campier and with show tunes. That would be fun! Oh wait, that film exists. It's called The Apple, and I'm not gonna say that's a great film. In fact, it's quite terrible. But, I mean...
Meet an actual vampire.
It sticks with ya. And yeah, part of that is definitely thanks to its awkwardly integral religious theme, but it also helps that it isn't bogging itself down by trying to be the act that follows the Beatles. Bigger than Jesus indeed, I guess. Of course, this best case scenario option did not happen. The Beatles' music is used in this movie, which leads to our main characters being underdeveloped, weird side characters that don't advance the plot in any real way, the plot stopping for almost pointless musical interludes, and outside of the actual text, a different cultural perception of it as well. Because it's not just any movie musical anymore. It's a movie musical soundtracked by the greatest band in the world. Also, we already had a film about the fictional Sgt. Pepper's band leaving their beloved town to defeat a big bad with a terrible name. It's called Yellow Submarine, and that one is, and was seen at the time, seen as great. So we really didn't need this film. The involvement of the Beatles is this film's nail in the coffin, the root of all its evil. We're near the end, dear viewer. Let's look at everyone's careers post Sgt. Pepper. Part 10, Where Are They Now? The Robert Stigwood empire continued on with various highs, such as the soundtrack for The Empire Strikes Back, and later on the fellow album-turned-musical-turned-film Evita, and various lows, such as Grease 2 and the long-after-disco's relevance Sylvester Stallone penned Stayin' Alive. The biggest casualty here was RSO Records, which was hurt not just by Pepper, but by the Bee Gees' lawsuit against Stigwood and his countersuit 2 years later. In 1981, Stigwood had completely left the label, and in 1983 it would be absorbed into Polygram, now Polydor, Records. As I said before, Robert continued producing films, but also worked on a stage revival of Grease, as well as a musical version of Saturday Night Fever. He would later pass on at the age of 81 in 2016. The Bee Gees were also hurt by this film, although they did have a comeback in 1979 with Spirits Having Flown, although their careers never came back to their height once the Disco Sucks movement came about. They soon went into the aforementioned legal conflict with Robert Stigwood. They did eventually make up, by the way. They had success after Spirits writing songs for Diana Ross and Barbra Streisand. They also had a second, smaller comeback in 1987 with ESP, which gave them the UK #1 hit, You Win Again. Maurice Gibb died in 2003 due to a heart attack, and sadly Robin also passed on in 2012 due to liver and kidney failure. Barry is the only living member now, but at this point their legacy is set in stone. You might have even seen their HBO documentary from last year. I saw it too! Isn't it great how it just completely refuses to acknowledge Sgt. Pepper's, as if it never actually happened? Speaking of Barbra Streisand though, Sandy Farina never acted again after this film, but she did co-write the #1 hit Kiss Me in the Rain, off of Streisand's 1979 album Wet. She also released an album entitled All Alone in the Night in 1980. Peter Frampton is the one that was most hurt by this film, this and the near-fatal car crash he went through the same year. His career was very hurt by this, and it never came back to those pre-1978 times. Although for the record, he also had a minor mid-80s comeback. It's probably clear that his acting career didn't do much. His movie deal with Orion Pictures was cancelled after all this, although he did have a role in the aforementioned Almost Famous, which he has said canceled out being in what he has so lovingly called the worst rock movie ever made. Henry Edwards did not have a career in fiction after this, although according to IMDb he did write something called The Great Skycopter Rescue. His career seems to truly lie in nonfiction. Michael Schultz would continue on with films. His next movie, 1979's Scavenger Hunt, did not do well with the critics. There was also Denzel Washington's film debut Carbon Copy, and Schultz's 2 films with hip-hop group The Fat Boys, Disorderlies, and other musical of his, Crush Groove. Steve Martin was not hurt by this film. He made his starring role debut the following year in The Jerk, and you might have also seen him in that other zany medical professional singing role. Oh, and of course, the one my dad likes, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Aerosmith also weren't hurt by this film. They had a pretty big downside in the next few years for other reasons, but they had a big comeback, once again starting in the mid-80s, and they are doing pretty well for themselves. And of course, the Beatles were not hurt by this film at all, at least not in the long run, unless you're insane and have spent weeks working on a video essay about this. It's been months now! Yay! Sgt. Pepper's is most definitely not the first thing you think of when you think the Beatles, or even the smaller waters of Beatles-related movies. That Pirates of the Caribbean movie Paul did a cameo in probably comes up more in regular conversation than this. Oh, and if you're wondering, everybody else ended up pretty unscathed as well. Part 11. We hope you have enjoyed the show. Well, everyone, it's the moment you've been waiting for ever since you clicked on this video, looked at the description, and realized with horror that this thing had 11 parts. It's the end! Most of the reason why I decided to do this for Sgt. Pepper's is that I'm amazed that it exists. That somebody not only came up with this idea, but stuck with it through failure until they finally saw it through. I'd call it admirable, but considering how the film crashed and burned like a Sgt. Pepper themed hot air balloon with magical gaudy outfits, it's really more like a cautionary tale. It's a lot of people at the height of their popularity coming together, and it just seemed like such a good idea at the time. And it failed. And that's interesting. And that deserves to be looked at and analyzed in the same way that every single thing the Beatles ever said, did, or made has been. So here I am, cruelly bringing this knowledge to you as my contribution to the world of music academia. I'll probably send this to some local film festivals, try and send press releases to the news. Maybe someday even Paul and Ringo will see this. Hi if you're watching, by the way. And then everybody can be cruelly burdened with this knowledge. And it won't just be me. You're welcome. You know, I am very happy with my research here, but you know the worst thing? There is still stuff I haven't gotten to. So we might as well breeze through the things I forgot to talk about at the 11th and a half hour. Dee Anthony, Peter Frampton's manager, who was rumored to have siphoned off money from the band Humble Pie to promote Peter's wildly successful live album, and was also alleged to have ties to crime families? Frampton and Dee parted ways after this, by the way. According to IMDb, this film was, at its time, the highest budget ever given to a black director, so at least some good came out of it. The way that Stigwood and Anthony bald-faced lied to Peter about how Paul McCartney was going to be the weather vane that Deus Ex Machina's everything, that wasn't true. How 2 weeks into the film, the Bee Gees went to Robert Stigwood's house and begged him to take them out of the movie. B.D. Hoffler's name officially is, for some reason, B.D. Brockhurst. And of course how, when script problems arose, conferences would be held around the pool of Robert's tax exile home in Bermuda. And that's basically everything. At least everything important. I'd like to thank everyone who stuck around to the end of this video essay. Y'all are amazing. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and all the other YouTube things. Thanks for watching. I'm NKZ. Strawberry Fields Forever. Anything to do with the Beatles is very complicated. Robert Stigwood.